Cruyff's _football, the revolution that changed football forever. Johan Cruyff's total football didn't just win trophies. It turned fixed positions into shifting roles, making teams harder to mark and impossible to predict. Rotations and reorganizations in 3D. Rotation means a deliberate, timed swap. When one player leaves a zone, a teammate fills it immediately so the shape stays intact. Picture a striker dropping to collect the ball. A central midfielder sprints forward to occupy the striker's lane. The right winger tucks inside, and the right fullback steps into midfield. That sequence preserves passing lanes, creates numerical overloads where you want them, and forces opponents into uncomfortable decisions. This is not abstract artistry. It's a set of triggers and actions you can practice. Triggers: pressure on the ball, an open half space, or a teammate's angled run. Actions: a supporting run into the vacated space, a short angled pass to the moving player, and a quick first touch to turn play. Execution keys are timing, angle of support, and communication. One touch to free the passer, diagonal runs to stretch markers, and matching speed so the rotation looks seamless. Watch to see game clips that break down who rotates when and why, and stay for simple drills, rondos with rotation rules, three-way passing ladders, and positional shadow play that teach the exact footwork, passing angles, and triggers that made total football work. By the end, you'll understand not just the idea, but how to make rotations happen on your pitch. Effective teams treat the field as three interacting dimensions: lateral width, forward-back depth, and the vertical layers between defensive, midfield, and attacking lines, and coordinate player movement so those dimensions are constantly rebalanced. This is about controlled exchanges. One player moves out of a zone and another fills the vacancy immediately, while a third alters depth to create passing lanes or stretch the opponent. Simple on paper, exacting in execution. When a center back steps into midfield to receive, the holding midfielder must shift laterally or drop between the defensive pair to maintain cover. That single action changes the axis of play and opens a diagonal lane for a full-back to travel into space on the flank. Timing is crucial. If the center back drifts too early, the opponent can press him. If too late, the overlap is intercepted. Rotations must be practiced with triggers and clear cues so they are not chaotic. Use arrival triggers such as a back three passing into a half space, a striker dropping into the pocket, or a winger cutting inside. Each trigger has a prescribed response. The nearest midfielder checks his run, the adjacent defender shifts out, the fullback accelerates into the outside corridor. Communication is short and concrete. Names, numbers, or hand signals, and body orientation matters. The receiving player should present his body to the field, offering a quick passing angle and a view of the next third. Practical sequences illustrate the concept. A forward dropping between lines pulls a marker with him. A midfielder steps forward into the vacated half space and becomes the new playmaker, while the opposite fullback arcs forward to occupy space behind the defensive line. In another sequence, as the ball is circulated wide, an inside midfielder drifts toward the touchline to draw a central defender out. A central striker then makes a run behind the recognition lane opened by that displacement. Clear brief. Create lines for through balls and corridors for overlaps. Drills convert theory into habit. Run positional rondos that limit touches and require the passer to vacate his original spot after releasing the ball, forcing teammates to rotate into the freed zone. Small-sided games with defined channels and a dedicated free player encourage vertical rotations across lines. The free player must constantly exchange positions with whoever receives the ball. Use progressive overload. Start with passive defenders, then increase pressure so rotations become automatic under duress. Defensive reorganizations mirror offensive rotations and must be equally practiced. When a wing forward presses, a nearby midfielder should compress inward and a fullback shift to cover the flank. Simultaneously, the center backs slide to narrow the gaps. Quick recovery runs and compactness reduce the opponent's ability to exploit the newly created channels. Short coaching cues here make a difference. Slide, cover, balance, spoken crisply and timed. Coaching focus points. Always create a triangle when rotating, so there are two passing options and one covering support. Keep distance between lines compact enough to prevent vertical penetration, but long enough to offer progressive passing. And use half spaces as preferred destinations because occupying them forces the opposition to make uncomfortable choices. Each rotation must be purposeful. It should aim to free a player, open a seam, or overload an area. Finally, read the game and adapt rotations to opponent behavior. If opponents habitually follow players into channels, use decoy runs and leave the ball to a winger arriving late. If they sit deep, enlarge width, and use diagonal rotations to create cutback opportunities. Practice under varying conditions so players learn when to hold shape and when to willingly reorganize the entire structure to force an advantage. The philosophy of total football. Every outfield player must be technically comfortable on the ball and able to read space so teammates can interchange roles without collapsing the team shape. That requirement is not an abstract ideal. It is a practical baseline that dictates who plays, how sessions are run, and what is expected in possession and out of it. Players learn to control under pressure, pass with purpose, and maintain body orientation to see both the ball and the space they intend to move into. These are measurable training objectives that feed directly into on-field execution. Rotations are executed as a chain of predictable, rehearsed movements tied to ball location and opponent orientation. When a striker drops into the pocket between the opposition's midfield and defense, a midfielder must immediately occupy the striker's previous channel or the nearest half space to keep a numerical balance. If an outside forward drifts inside to create overloads, the fullback on that side advances into the vacated flank to preserve width. The nearest central midfielder then shifts laterally to cover the half space left by the advancing fullback. Triggers for these swaps are clear: loss of body angle on the ball, a teammate receiving with back to goal, or a successful pass that opens a new lane. Timing matters. Late movement creates gaps, and early movement signals markable intentions to the opponent. In practice, the player vacating a position must check shoulder, communicate, and execute the pass or carry that makes the rotation meaningful. Clear role assignments during rotations prevent chaos. One player acts as the cover. When a teammate pushes forward or drifts out of position, the cover player delays his forward action and instead fills the immediate defensive void. Another player provides support by offering a quick pass option or an angled run that opens space. A third player becomes the creator, carrying the ball into the newly formed pocket or delivering the decisive pass. For example, when a center back steps into midfield to help build through pressure, the opposite center back widens to take responsibility for the flank space and provide the long diagonal outlet. Simple coaching cues: cover first, then carry, check shoulder before vacating, and speak the swap. Turn these abstract roles into actions that players can repeat under match speed. Defensive rotations are equally structured and tied to pressing triggers. When the team presses high and a forward abandons the front line to challenge a center back who receives the ball, the nearest midfielder angles up to block easy exits, and the adjacent fullback tucks inside to deny the pass into midfield. If the press is bypassed, the team shifts into compact lines quickly. Midfielders drop into a staggered block, and the deeper center back becomes the pivot to shepherd transitions. Communication and recognition are crucial. Players must identify the press trigger, poor body orientation by a defender, a loose pass, or a back-to-goal touch, and respond instantly with the correct covering movement. Short, athletic shifts keep the defensive shape intact and make opponents pay for misplaced passes. Training translates theory into reproducible execution. Rondo variations that force players to rotate after 2 touches build the habit of moving into space and checking shoulders. Positional games that limit players to multiple positions across a session force adaptability and reinforce the concept of becoming comfortable with different demands. Coaches use shadow play walkthroughs to rehearse specific rotation sequences: striker drop, midfield shift, fullback overlap, so that muscle memory matches tactical intention. In small-sided scenarios, set a rule that a player must rotate into a teammate's original position after a completed pass. This enforces the sequence of vacate, cover, and occupy without breaking team balance. Match-level application focuses on situational execution rather than philosophical purity. During a sustained build-up, the goalkeeper becomes an active outfield option, and a center-back stepping into midfield is not a novelty, but an expected pivot to break a press. When possession is won inside the opponent half, immediate lateral rotations create overloads on the weak side and allow vertical passes to exploit the created gaps. Consistency comes from repetition in training, clear verbal cues during games, and trust that teammates will cover when vacating roles. The result is a living system. Rotations create space, cover preserves balance, and collective movement converts theoretical principles into concrete chances to score and deny chances to concede. Influence on modern teams. Modern top clubs have absorbed total football's central premise that flexible positional interchanges generate space and numerical superiority, and they apply it as a practical blueprint rather than an abstract ideal. Teams aim to manipulate specific channels and half spaces, not just swap shirts. The objective is to create predictable patterns of movement that opponents struggle to mark. Clubs known for this approach emphasize structured freedom. Players have primary zones, but are drilled to move into adjacent zones when teammates vacate them, keeping vertical and horizontal balance intact. This shifts the emphasis from isolated individual brilliance to coordinated group movements that open high-quality passing lanes. Rotations are taught as repeated, rehearsed sequences with clear triggers and role responsibilities. For example, in a 4-3-3 attacking rotation, the center forward dropping into midfield is a deliberate action that invites a winger to enter the half space, while the fullback overlaps on the outside. These three linked actions, drop, cut inside, overlap, create a corridor that breaks the opposition's defensive line. Midfield rotations often follow a rule set. The deepest midfielder covers when a partner steps into the half space. The advanced midfielder fills the vacated pivot, and the wide midfielder tucks in to form a temporary diamond when the ball is on the opposite flank. Defensive rotations are equally structured. The nearest player presses the ball, a second player blocks the primary passing lane, and a third provides cover behind, with the goalkeeper pushing up to shorten angles if the center back split. These patterns have explicit triggers: an opponent's touch, a backward pass, or a winger turning his body, and players are trained to recognize and act on those cues immediately. Theory is linked to execution through consistent, specific practice drills rather than vague exhortations. Coaches use rondos constrained by zones to force on-the-ball players to rotate quickly and teach off-the-ball players to occupy the correct replacement space. A typical drill: 6v4 in half the pitch with predetermined rotation roles. Two attackers must rotate with central midfielders after every 3 passes, while fullbacks are only allowed to overlap after a switch of play. This builds the timing and spatial awareness needed in matches. Shadow pattern sessions, where the team walks through sequences at half speed, reinforce the spatial relationships before adding opposition pressure. Video sessions focus on identifying the moment a rotation should start, using freeze frames to show where the third-man run should land and what passing lane becomes available as a result. Contemporary examples show how these rotations affect both possession and transition phases without resorting to mysticism. Teams that master rotations can draw opponents out of a compact block, creating isolated one-on-one situations and diagonal lanes for penetrating passes. They also sustain higher pressing intensity, because rotating positions allows players to be in the right places to counterpress immediately after a turnover. Practical coaching priorities are straightforward. Define clear roles for each rotation. Drill the triggers and the exact lane to occupy. Practice under varying pressure levels, and measure success by the frequency of completed rotation sequences that lead to progressive carries or penetrative passes. Small, repeatable actions, time drops, precise half-space movements, coordinated overlaps, produce the large tactical gains seen in modern teams that have translated total football's principles into reliable, match-winning routines. Which modern teams use total football? Several top clubs and national teams today build large parts of their tactical identity on total football principles. Ajax, FC Barcelona, Manchester City, Bayern Munich, the Netherlands national team, and Arsenal are among the most visible examples. Each applies the core idea of players exchanging positions and creating overloads, but they implement it with different emphasis and personnel. Some focus on inverted fullbacks and midfield triangles. Others prioritize youth players trained to play multiple roles. The common thread is planned rotation sequences that are rehearsed and triggered by specific game states. Ajax's pathway remains the clearest living laboratory for rotations in action. Their academy trains players to move across lines so that a center-back can step into midfield while a fullback pushes up to occupy the wide channel, and a midfielder slides wide to maintain balance. A concrete rotation looks like this. Ball arrives to the left center-back, who steps forward into the midfield zone. The left fullback advances into the vacated central lane. The left winger tucks inside to form a midfield triangle. The striker drops slightly to open a vertical passing lane. Coaches practice that sequence until the timing between the first step of the center-back and the winger's tuck is automatic, because the effectiveness depends on synchronized movement, not inspiration. Barcelona uses similar patterns, but often ties them to a pivot and half-space occupation. The pivot drops between the center-backs to receive under pressure, which allows an advanced midfielder to push into the half-space. When the striker drops into the channel, a winger or attacking midfielder moves into the central void, and a fullback either overlaps or inverts depending on space. Execution is typically rehearsed through positional rondos and shadow play, with players assigned primary and secondary zones so that rotations are predictable yet flexible. Teams that copy this model place emphasis on short, precise passing and stepped movement so that the sequence can be completed before the opponent's defensive shape reconstitutes. Manchester City demonstrates how total football rotations can be married to modern positional play and pressing triggers. Their fullbacks frequently invert into midfield to create central numerical superiority. Midfielders then shift wide to free the half space for advanced playmakers. A typical City rotation, a fullback tucks into a midfield role to form a back three, a central midfielder drifts into the half space, while the opposite winger cuts inside to become the high forward, and the striker drifts wide to drag a center back out of position. Triggers for the rotation are specific, receiving the ball under moderate pressure in the half space or when a switch of play is imminent. So players practice recognizing those cues in training and adjusting their body orientation to anticipate the next pass. Bayern Munich and the Netherlands national side show another application, using hybrid players who are comfortable both on the flank and centrally to maintain continuity when rotations occur. Players such as those who have operated as both fullback and midfielder are used to blur lines. The result is a fluid midfield that can overload one side and quickly switch through a rotating pivot. On the pitch, one sees center backs stepping into midfield, midfielders sprinting to occupy wide half spaces, and attackers interchanging positions to open passing lanes. Coaches often rehearse these sequences in phase-of-play drills that isolate one trigger, press, wide switch, or central penetration, so that the rotation becomes an automatic reaction rather than a creative improvisation. Arsenal's implementation under a coaching staff influenced by positional play shows how clubs can selectively adopt total football rotations without wholesale copying. They emphasize inverted or advanced fullbacks, midfielders who rotate between the hold and the half space, and forwards who exchange wide and central roles to create overloads. Practically, their rotations are practiced in 7v7 and 9v9 drills where specific players are given license to rotate on certain cues. This builds the pattern recognition necessary for in-game execution. For teams and coaches wanting to translate the theory into practice, clarity of roles and explicit triggering rules are essential. Drill design should replicate the sequence you want. Designate which player initiates rotation, which two players swap zones, and what the numerical aim is, e.g., create 3v2 in midfield. Use progressive constraints. First allow the rotation without pressure, then add passive defenders, then full match pressure, so timing and spatial awareness develop. Communication markers are also practical. A single shout, a hand signal, or a body orientation rule, e.g., pivot drops on the first forward pass, speeds recognition. Matchday execution depends on those rehearsed cues. Players must identify the trigger, complete the rotation within a defined time window, and maintain balance, so counterpressing can be applied if possession is lost. Defensive teams facing these rotations exploit the moments of voluntary vacating of positions, so modern practitioners teach counter-rotations as well. That means training both the rotation and the recovery. Who fills the vacated flank if the fullback drifts inside? And what compactness looks like when the striker drops? The most effective modern exponents of total football prepare for the transitional moments as meticulously as they rehearse the rotational sequences themselves. Competition with other tactics. Opponents who lined up with rigid man-marking or compact low blocks forced total football to prove itself in concrete, tactical terms on the pitch. When a forward drops into midfield and the opposing marker commits to following, a vacuum opens behind him. That space is where rotations become a practical weapon rather than a theory. Teams that relied on strict marking had to choose between leaving a dangerous zone unguarded or handing free rein to a technically superior player. Short passes and angled runs exploit that hesitation. Rotations are executed through clear, repeatable movements. When a striker drops, a winger or attacking midfielder must sprint into the central lane immediately. A fullback pushes up into midfield only if a defensive midfielder covers the channel. Coaches train the sequence in drills that rehearse triggers. For example, a designated drop signal from the ball carrier prompts a pre-planned interchange, while the nearest midfielder steps laterally to fill the vacated flank. In practice, a 4-3-3 becomes a fluid 3-2-5 for brief moments, but only if the third center back or holding mid provides cover. Rondo work enforces the quick touch-and-go combinations needed to make rotations effective. Shadow play sessions ingrain who covers whom when positions are exchanged. Facing compact counter-attacking systems highlights the costs of excessive rotation. Vacated zones can be exposed to fast transitions if players are slow to recover. Opponents that sit deep and strike on the break exploit the moment a fullback is high and a midfielder is pulled wide. To counter that, teams embed a balancer role, a disciplined defensive midfielder whose job is to delay counters and screen the backline while others rotate. On the training ground, this is practiced with half-field transition games. Attackers attempt to move the ball through rotating patterns while a reduced defensive unit practices immediate covering movements and quick reorganization into a defensive block. Communication is non-negotiable here. Concise shouts and visual cues prevent two players from following the same run and leaving another zone empty. When facing aggressive presses that try to force turnovers, rotations must be adapted to focus on passing triangles and vertical mobility. Short, decisive 1-2s dislodge a presser, and a quick diagonal pass into a newly occupied channel can beat a coordinated press. Coaches emphasize ball-first rotation. Move to create angles rather than just swap positions. This small practical shift helps avoid predictable patterns that a disciplined opponent can anticipate. Conversely, against a deep, narrow block, the practical execution is to overload the wide areas with overlapping fullbacks and third-man runs, drawing a marker out of position and creating a lane for a penetrating pass. Every rotation, therefore, carries a tactical calculation. Is the objective to create space centrally, to drag a defender laterally, or to open a corridor for a direct run behind the line? Adaptation in-game is the hallmark of success when total football met other tactics. Managers instruct players on clear contingency roles: who stays as the last cover, who counters a marker's pursuit, who must instantly switch from attack to containment when possession is lost. Video analysis and set-piece planning also feed into this competition. Opponents study rotation patterns and pre-assign defensive responses. So teams practicing total football must add variation and deception to their rotations to remain unpredictable. In short, rotations are not abstract ideals. They are rehearsed movements tied to triggers, protective coverages, and recovery protocols designed specifically to outmaneuver man-marking, unlock compact defenses, and withstand the threat of rapid counters. Cruyff's total football changed the game by making position a tool, not a prison. Everyone can move, everyone covers. Key points to take away: origins at Ajax and Barcelona. The core principles of fluid positional interchange, aggressive collective pressing, and using rotation to create space and overloads. Rotations are simple in action. When the striker drops to pull a center back out, A midfielder pushes up into the striker's zone, and a fullback pushes into midfield or wide to keep the shape balanced. That deliberate swapping, striker into midfield, midfielder into attack, fullback into midfield, preserves team structure while constantly changing who the opponent must mark. In practice, it looks like a three-step sequence. Receive, shift, occupy, receive the ball, shift position to pull a defender, occupy the newly opened pocket. Link theory to execution. Coaches train this with small-sided games, rondos that force position swaps, and rehearsal of specific rotation loops, striker, midfielder, fullback, until players read cues rather than commands. Drills emphasize awareness, short passing, angled runs, and fitness so the team can press immediately after a turnover and cover for the rotating teammate. If you felt this impulse while watching gameplay unfold, try to spot rotational formations in your next match or training session. Give it a like if this helped you see the game differently. Subscribe to the channel for detailed breakdowns of drills and training plans that teach these rotations, and share examples from players' practice in the comments.